Welcome to Beyond the Next Chapter. I'm your host, Whitney Clark. And today on the podcast, we're taking a little bit of a different turn to talk about a really important topic that has to do with our mental health. And that is trauma. And trauma in the workplace specifically, how we can cope, what to do if you've experienced trauma of any kind, and how to even really recognize that you've experienced some sort of trauma. So joining us today is Gretchen Schmelzer. She's a licensed psychologist and trauma survivor who has worked in this field for 25 years. She has a book that was originally published in 2018. It's called Journey Through Trauma, and she's working on a second book right now. So thank you so much for being here.
It's great to be here, Whitney. Thanks so much for having me.
So let's talk a little bit about you and what you do, specifically when it comes to workplace and trauma and going into certain workplaces and talking to employees about what they've been through in certain jobs.
Yeah, so I've been doing a lot of work, especially in the last 2 years, working with different jobs that have trauma as a routine part of the job. So if you think about first responders or emergency room physicians, and in the last 2 weeks, I've been working with the U.S. Forest Service and the wildland firefighters there. So helping them understand the impact of trauma and what they can do to both heal from it and also kind of create a maintenance system so that they can go through every day and not feel so exhausted.
I think we should start from sort of the beginning and sort of define what is trauma, because it is a word that sort of gets thrown around a lot, especially right now. What is trauma?
So there's different kinds. Not all trauma is the same. So the first kind of trauma that most people will recognize is an acute trauma, which is an event or experience that overwhelms your capacity to defend or protect yourself. The hallmarks of trauma are helplessness and fear. So if you think of a car accident, for example, and we all have the same physiological reactions to an acute trauma. In fact, a giraffe has the same physiological reactions to an acute trauma. Our blood pressure goes up, our heart rate goes up, all the blood goes to our major muscle groups, and our focus narrows so we can really pay attention to what's coming at us. And so we're geared up to either fight or flight, right, around something that's scary. But there's also another kind of trauma, which I call repeated trauma. So that's trauma that happens more than once. And it's one thing if you're in a car accident once, but if you're in a car accident every day for years, your body actually isn't going to gear up for every single trauma it's running into. So people who live through war or domestic violence or child abuse or racial violence, if you're constantly having an onslaught of trauma coming at you, your body actually starts shutting down. So your brain and body kind of separate, your body kind of shuts down, and so you're not wasting all that energy gearing up. And that has a different impact on people, so that they end up with three kinds of trauma. They end up with what happened, the second kind is the protections they use to survive the trauma, and the third aspect of repeated trauma is what didn't happen, the growth and development that doesn't happen while trauma is occurring.
Mm-hmm. If someone's listening to this and they're thinking, hey, you know what, this kind of sounds like me, what are some of the telltale signs that their body is telling them, hey, you've been through something traumatic repeatedly?
Yep. Actually being kind of numb or not having much emotion. It's like almost the extremes, not having any emotions at all or being like kind of hyper vigilant about everything. It might be that they avoid conversations where there's emotion, or they act like everything's fine. Often people who've been through repeated trauma, in that what didn't happen, people often didn't learn a lot of while trauma's happening, we stop growing. So if a kid lives through trauma through their childhood, they often don't learn the things that they're supposed to learn, like asking for help or how to make friends or how to plan an activity. So those are, if you find that as an adult, you actually don't know how to ask for help from anybody, or you don't know how to plan something from start to finish, things you might have learned from a healthy adult when you were a kid, those can be signs.
What are some examples of traumatic things? I mean, I think when you think of trauma, you think of somebody going off to war, of sexual assault, something like that. But what are some examples of trauma that someone might not really think is a traumatic event?
Right. First of all, I would say, if trauma is an event that overwhelms your capacity to defend or protect yourself, first you need to understand that not everybody has the same protections, right? So something that's traumatic to one person may not be traumatic to another, and vice versa. But some of those things might be, being yelled at repeatedly as a child, or being neglected or ignored, being alone all the time. It might be having people be very critical of you, like you might be in a dating relationship where somebody's always critical. Those things are actually, over the long term, are quite traumatic.
You work with people in the workplace, so you go to specific jobs and help with dealing with these types of things. You mentioned you most recently were with some fire crews in California. Yep. What are some examples of things that those crews go through and see that would warrant professional help?
Well, they're seeing forests that they've protected all these years burn to the ground. So the loss of the forest themselves is traumatic. They witness, they see dead bodies, they see people losing their homes. While they're off fighting fires, their homes are sometimes burned. So there's a lot of trauma that happens in their jobs.
What are some of the jobs and people you work with that tend to be, I guess, the most traumatic? Not like we're giving out an award for who's the most traumatic, but what are some of the other examples of professions where it's something you see on a more regular basis?
I've worked with physicians who do palliative care at children's hospitals, and they witness children dying, which is really, really difficult. What's hard about trauma jobs is that you sign up for it because of the mission and passion you have. So people often know they're signing up for a difficult job. I don't know that they know the sacrifices they make when they sign up. So you sacrifice the illusion that the world doesn't have these hard things, because you see them every day, right? I've worked with police chiefs who, are witnessing shootings and mass shootings. I've worked with journalists, newsroom directors who've talked about their journalists who some of them won't go to the scene anymore, that they've gone to 3 school shootings in Colorado and they are done. They don't want to see it anymore. So it's in some ways these things have repeated so much, but it's more that the loss of children, I think, hits people the worst.
I mean, I think you don't have to be a parent or have kids to be so emotionally changed and moved by witnessing something like that, or talking to someone who's lost a child.
Yes.
And just to pull back the curtain a little bit, you are here today also because you're speaking to our newsroom and the journalists in our newsroom about the trauma that we see in the workforce. I don't know if this is the right way to explain it, but I guess, is it like secondhand trauma? Like, what happens to you when you're a person like myself, a journalist, who is hearing about someone's life story and then relaying it to viewers? It didn't happen to me, but it feels like it happened to me.
Yes, it's a great point, because we talked about acute trauma, we talked about repeated trauma, right? And now we're talking about vicarious trauma or secondary traumatic stress. And that is when we witness somebody else's suffering, or we read about trauma, or we see it. And the amazing thing about the human brain is it almost doesn't matter whether we experience it ourselves or we watch it. Our brains take that in as an experience of trauma.
Wow.
And we have these things called mirror neurons, where if I'm pretending to throw a football, your motor neurons in your brain are lighting up as if your arm was throwing a football. Like, we are constantly in tune with each other, actually. And so when I'm witnessing somebody else's suffering, I'm experiencing some of that in myself. And it's cute. The problem with vicarious trauma is it's cumulative. It kind of sneaks up on you. It's like an invisible toxic substance that when it reaches a certain point, it has an impact, and it changes. I mean, I can ask you, but it changes the way you view the world, right? I mean, in the conversations I've had with the people in your newsroom over the last couple days, people talked about the fact that, before they had kids, they did, reporting on a children's hospital and felt one way. And after they had children, when that same reporting came up, they felt something else.
I also think, I've been in this line of work for more than 10 years now, almost 15 years. And something that made me cry today isn't necessarily something that would have made me as emotional 10 years ago. And I think that just when you said that, it's like it is sort of like a buildup. You know what I mean? You can't go all this time and hear all these stories without it eventually sort of like breaking you, I guess, is the only way to describe it.
And this is where actually the conversation about trauma is limited in my mind, because it's a psychological term, right? And it's healed in the psychology world. I'm a psychologist. I get to play in that area. But the things we're talking about, like the human tragedies we are talking about, is humanity, right? There's almost a spiritual aspect, but I don't even know if that's the right word. But there's a deepening of who you are as a person, because you're holding all these truths about what people live through. We have to heal trauma, and I believe in healing it, but we also have to expand the conversation somehow to say, I'm holding something bigger than just whether I feel good or not. Right? I'm witnessing, I am honored enough to witness somebody else's life in this moment, and I can't fix it, and I'm going to hold it, and I'm going to help other people understand that this exists in the world, right? And that's big.
What would your advice be to someone who's a journalist or, a doctor in one of these positions that's getting that sort of secondary, I guess? Is that the right way to say it? What was the way you phrased it? What was the way vicarious trauma?
Yes.
How do you go about, like for someone like myself or someone else who's listening, like a police officer who hears stories and sees these things happening? How do you go about processing that trauma? How do you go about learning to sort of, I guess, not just live with it, but to be comfortable and a happy, successful person?
Yeah. So what I've been talking about here is, first of all, paying attention to what I call the roller coaster of extreme stress. It's actually a model created by a guy named Gil Martin. He worked with police and first responders. And part of it is just paying attention to your workday, which is that you go to work and you kind of go up above the line, your middle center line, your window of tolerance. And you go, because it's an adrenaline filled job, right? You're on it. It's time based. And this is true actually of every one of these, like first responders, physicians, like you're in your mode, right? And actually on your best days, you feel good up there, right? You almost feel at your best, and you're like a war buddies, like you've got your people. And then you finish your long shift and you go home and you go plummet below your window of tolerance. And you get home and you sit in your comfy chair and you're like scrolling or binge watching or drinking your adult beverage of choice, and you're kind of done.
Yeah.
Right? And the problem is when you're in that kind of hypoarousal state, you're not actually rejuvenating or repairing anything. And you'll go to sleep, and you'll go back up of line the next day, and you'll keep doing this roller coaster. And if you are below the line, if you don't intentionally do something to shift, it'll take your body 18 hours to come back to center. And who has 18 hours, right? So you have to intentionally own this roller coaster. So if you're above the line on your way home, in order to shift, you have to do something that's soothing.
Okay. And that varies per person.
Exactly.
Okay. So it could be, what would be some examples of exercise, music, kind of just runs the gamut?
Calling a friend on the way home, getting home and walking your dog, getting home and watering your plants, getting home and making dinner with your kids. I know a dad who would get home and watch the Avengers or some TV show with his kids in half an hour increments. And that was a way he could engage with his kids, but not have to be at his best.
Yeah.
Right. And make that shift. But in the last 2 years, the physicians who are doing this, are intentionally making the shift, are really noticing a difference.
Okay. What are some of the most common issues, questions, problems that people come to you with when you're going to these workplace trainings?
Some of it is about the transitions home. I do fine at work and then I get home and lose it, is one of the things people say. And part of that is that actually we save up our difficulty for our attachment people. So we do save it for home, just the way kids fall apart on their parents when they get home from school. But also, it's partly not making that transition intentionally, right? So they're looking for that. Another is really are gender-based. So a lot of the men in some of these programs, especially the firefighters, are, they're taught their whole lives not to have a feeling, right? And here we're trying to explain that if you don't have a coherent narrative, including the feelings about your trauma, it doesn't move to the past. So, but they're basically like, we were raised to like, stop crying, I'll give you something to cry about, or like men don't cry. And working against those cultural norms is part of the work here.
Yeah. I feel like you kind of just described my day perfectly. I'm like on top of the world, boom, 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 boom. I can literally do anything. I'm like on top of everything. And then I literally go home and I sit on my phone and I'm like frozen, like literally frozen. And it'll be 4 hours later and I'm like, what in the world just happened to me? Like, what did I do? So I feel like now I kind of have an idea of it. And then I feel bad because I'm like, oh, I'm being lazy and I'm doom scrolling on my phone. You know what I mean? There's some guilt associated with that as well when you just go home and just like crash.
Right. So it really is helpful to know when you're above the line to shift, you need to soothe. If you've already found yourself in a chair and doom scrolling, what you need to do to come out of that is to energize. So you need to like do some physical activity or listen to louder music or dance it out in the kitchen and that is it's a little bit harder to come back up. So I really recommend you having kind of a support network. Like on Tuesdays, I'm going to call you and you're going to pull me out of a hole. Or I'm going to go for a walk and I'm going to talk to you while I'm walking on the phone, right? Or some way to get some help out of that hole.
One thing you talk about in your book is that you can't do any of this alone. And how helpful are other people? And how helpful is the friend at the end of the phone line, or your partner, or somebody else at home?
Yep. So one of my principles is no one heals alone. And first of all, because we are born connected, right? We depend on a bigger being to support us to growing older. Therefore, our brains are wired to grow and heal in connection. And that's one of the reasons why no one heals alone. I think that friends and colleagues can be huge sources of support around healing, especially workplace trauma, because you've gone through the trauma as a group. People heal best in the configuration in which they were hurt. So if you're hurt as a child in a parental situation, you probably heal best in therapy. If you're these wildland firefighters who go through a trauma together, they're going to heal best in that group.
I heard from some of my colleagues today that after they met with you, they felt validated. They felt like, oh, I feel validated. Like what I'm feeling has been okay. How important is having your feelings validated, whether you're a child or you're an adult?
It's hugely important, partly so that you don't dismiss them. Like if feelings are validated, then you actually pay attention to them. And then, I read recently this quote, and I wish I could remember where it's from, but basically, you can't solve a problem you're not willing to have, right? So if you can feel something, then you have choice about doing something about it. But if people are telling you, well, that's not real, you're going to start thinking it's not real, and then you're actually not going to take care of it.
Let's talk a little bit about your book. It came out in 2018, Journey Through Trauma. You say in the first, chapter, it's not a self-help book. How do you explain it to folks that haven't picked it up yet?
Yes. So for people who've gone through long-term repeated trauma, I find that they need more help than their partners or friends can give, partly because their partners or friends have a stake in their relationship and their outcome. And some of healing from trauma can be messy. And I usually ask people who've been through some severe trauma to go see a therapist, because the therapist doesn't have a stake in how that person behaves all the time, right? So they have a little more space and time to do that.
How do you know if talk therapy is the right thing for you, or if another kind of therapy might be more beneficial?
I think any therapy that helps you feel better is good, right? No, in all the research of talk therapy, The research shows that it's not the kind of therapy, it's the relationship between the therapist and the client that actually is ultimately what's healing. And the neuroscience research around talk therapy is that trauma lives in a part of our brain that is manages the day-to-day. So when we haven't healed trauma, it's as if it's always present. We're living it in real time. And when we create a narrative, a coherent narrative of the event, that trauma moves to our hippocampus where long-term memory is stored. So no matter what kind of therapy you do, you probably need to end on some kind of talk therapy so that it is a coherent narrative so that it can move to the past.
And in the book, you talk about this like 5-phase cycle. Can you kind of just like run through those phases?
Sure. The 5-phase cycle of healing from repeated trauma begins with preparation. So in much of the research around trauma, it's often the first phase is called safety, which if I'm a psychologist trying to provide my client safety, that's great. But as a client, many people who've experienced a lot of trauma don't know what it feels like to feel safe. And so it's this abstract term that they can't connect to, but everybody can prepare. I compare healing from trauma to going up Everest. And, you don't just like get on a plane and fly there because you couldn't manage the altitude. So you have to prepare. And so preparing for the preparation phase is the area of getting ready. It is knowing your strengths, working on the relationships around you, knowing what to do when you have a hard time. So getting really ready for the work. And then as you feel safer in that preparation phase, the story of trauma will come on up and out. That's the unintegration phase. And you will begin to start telling pieces of your story. And it's often like a jigsaw puzzle. Like different pieces will come up because trauma is stored as fragments and usually not as a whole story. And so you have to put the pieces together. And that's the identification phase. You start naming them like that experience made me feel helpless. Or disappointed, or you get more and more specific about what the feeling is and what actually happened. And as you name those things, you begin to see the whole experience, and that's integration. And integration's made up of 2 pieces, mourning and new beginning. And usually because when you see what happened, there is a sense of loss, like that happened to me, or I lived through that. And once it's the past, there also is this sense of new beginning, which is like, now what? Now what can I do? That what didn't happen of repeated trauma can start to get worked on. And as you begin to work on the what didn't happen, you move into consolidation. And you go through the cycle as much as you need to in order to heal.
How can trauma, and we've touched on this a little bit, how can trauma affect you in the long term? Like if it's a repeated trauma you had as a kid, as an adult 20 years later, how is that going to show up in your life?
It often shows up in order to survive the repeated trauma, you come up with a set of protections. And those protections can kind of become part of your personality, right? So you can end up being the person who always has to do stuff for other people and never can do stuff for themselves. Or you become the person who keeps everybody away, right? Or you can't commit to anything. So you create these ways of being in the world that made you feel safe then, but don't fit who you are now.
One of the things you talk about as well, and you mentioned this at the beginning, is you making sure your mind and your body are like connected. How can you tell if there's a mind-body disconnection?
That's a great question. I have a colleague, Eddie, who talks about the fact, like, can you feel your toes? Can you feel your butt in the chair? Like it's that basic. But also, do you know when you're hungry? Do you know when you have to pee? Do you know when you're like, do you find yourself all of a sudden like taking a really deep breath because you weren't even breathing?
Mm-hmm. And what are some ways to become more grounded and to become more in our body and not just in our head?
Right. It is actually slowing down and doing those things. Like, so taking a deep breath and feeling where your breath goes into, or wiggling your toes in your shoes. feeling like scanning your body for a second and saying, like, is there any place that feels tight?
Mm-hmm. What are some of the most common, I guess, questions, and what are you noticing in terms of the corporate world now being interested in mental health and bringing you in to talk to employees? Because I worked in news for a very long time, and this is the first time we've ever had someone like you come in before.
Right. So I can really state that it was COVID that broke the line, that invisible line between mental health and workplace. I've been doing leadership development work for 20 some odd years, and writing my book behind the scenes, like that. I wanted to keep my passion of writing about trauma. So my book came out in 2018, and while I was writing the book and selling the book, I was working in lots of different organizations, and I'd chat with the HR people about, like, oh, I'm writing this book, when we were just doing our chit chat before the work started. And when COVID happened, I got lots of phone calls from people who were like, hey, you always talked about this trauma thing. Would you talk to my people? And so I ended up doing probably 15 webinars in the first year of COVID.
Wow.
To different organizations who wanted to, especially managers were not trained to have conversations that they needed to have. A number of managers in different finance jobs in New York City whose people were falling apart. Mm-hmm. In New York, people were dying from COVID, or they had family members who were, and they were in living in apartments and trying to do childcare and run their division, and managers were getting all of this like heavy conversation, and they weren't trained for it.
Mm-hmm. Do you feel like this shift only continues to grow? Like more and more people are interested in dealing with trauma in the workplace?
Right now, it feels like it. I think, first of all, people can't unsee it. It's, in some ways, it was the bell that got rung. Mm-hmm. I also think that there are fields like medicine or first responders where more people left. I mean, think about how many nurses left during or post-COVID. Mm-hmm. And jobs where trauma is a routine part of the job are mission-driven jobs. People who came into them because they loved what they could offer. And actually, the people who leave those jobs leave in a sad state. They're not happy to leave. It's their only option. They're sort of jumping out of a plane. Mm-hmm. And, part of my passion is helping people stay in the jobs that they're so passionate about, right? Mm-hmm. And I think some of these fields are starting to recognize if we don't do something for our people, we're not going to have them.
Mm-hmm. I mean, journalism is one of the industries where people have sort of left in droves over the years. I mean, there's always, we're always staffed, you know what I mean? But I mean, you did lose a lot of people who left during COVID. A lot of things changed. What is your advice for people, whether it's a doctor or police officer in these mission-driven jobs, to focus on the mission? And, after a bad day where you witness something awful, you are getting this secondhand trauma, what's a good way to sort of like recalibrate and say, hey, you know what? There's a reason why I'm doing this. This is my mission.
Right. So, resilience is made up of three things. And I'm here to tell you, I'm not going to tell all these mission-driven people they just need to be more resilient. But one of those three things is something bigger than ourselves. It is our faith or our belief system or our purpose or mission. And it can be very recalibrating to ask people, why did you come into this field, right? Mm-hmm. And that is important and not enough. That if they're not recalibrating on a daily basis, in taking care of their body and taking care of their mental health, the mission can drive them until they're burned out.
Burnout is very real in all kinds of different industries. How can you come back from burnout?
I'm sorry to say that actually burnout takes a long time to come back from. So when somebody's really burned out, it can be months or a year. And so what I really want people to pay attention to is the check engine light that comes on. They need to pay attention at much smaller increments. That when you are exhausted, if you've spent 4 hours scrolling on your phone, you're probably really tired.
Yeah.
Right? And that I need, our body's like micro calibrations. Like if I'm dehydrated now, I need to drink water soon. I can't just be like, well, I'm dehydrated. I'll deal with that next Saturday when I have time, right? So the more, because if I don't, actually, I will end up very sick. Yeah. And the same is true around burnout. Burnout is much more, in my mental health world, as being a therapist, I would say burnout is much more like major depression than anything else. You have hit a place that's going to take a while to come back to. So really learning what your signs of stress are and addressing them sooner is how you don't get there.
What are some of those signs? I'm sure they would be different for everybody, but what would be some of the common signs?
You're sleeping but not feeling refreshed. You are you're losing things. You lose your keys all the time, or you're missing deadlines. You are, you're yelling at your kids in a way that you didn't before. You are, you're getting sick more often.
Mm-hmm. And what, obviously, like, we can't all just take like a 6-month vacation from our jobs, but it's sort of the everyday checking in with yourself, making sure you're not sort of getting to that low point and just being aware. And it sounds so simple, but it can be so hard to even just recognize how you're feeling in your body.
Right, because what we said earlier, you're cut off from your body, right? Yeah. Which is why you have to have some sense of self-awareness and be able to check in so that you have some choice about how you take care of yourself, right? And it's simple but not easy.
Mm-hmm. What got you interested in this line of work and trauma work specifically?
I think, having my own trauma history probably had me head into psychology. And once I was in it, I really became passionate about the kids and families I was working with. And they're being able to help them around trauma. So I was working on my own healing. I was working with them. And then when I was finishing my postdoc, I wanted to be the chief psychologist on a child psych unit. But a friend of mine asked me to help her think about how do you help countries come back from war. So they had gotten a gig with the United Nations helping countries strengthen their response to HIV and AIDS. And so I went and helped her think about that, and they offered me a job. So I ended up doing 4 years of work in Cambodia, helping the 100 leaders at a time strengthen their country's response to AIDS. So I was looking at trauma from my level, from the kids and families level, and at the country level. And looking at all that combined is what had me write my book, that I started to see patterns around how people come to heal. Mm-hmm.
In your book, you talk about the importance of having a healing relationship. Do you think everyone should try talk therapy at least one time in their lives?
I don't know that everybody needs to. I think if you lived a happy, healthy childhood, and you probably don't need to. Yeah. I think that if you haven't, or if you've experienced some pretty significant trauma, I think it can be really helpful. Mm-hmm. And to have somebody listen and witness and support your growth and development and allow you to find these pieces.
Mm-hmm. You're writing another book right now. Can you tell us a little bit about what it's about and why it's so important and why now is the time to put it out?
Yes. So I've been using my book to help people heal from trauma. And my book was written for people to heal from trauma, not for other professionals per se. And since I've been working so much in organizations, it's not a sort of one-to-one of here's how to heal with trauma, and here's how to help leaders understand how to help their people heal with trauma. Mm-hmm. And so this new book is going to be Leading Through Trauma, and it's going to be specifically to help leaders and managers in workplaces really understand what it takes to create workplaces where people can heal and grow.
What are some things managers, people listening now, can take away from this conversation?
First of all, we need to normalize trauma. Like, if you work in a field where trauma is a routine part of the job, let's normalize it. Let's say what trauma is and what the impact is on us. Let's normalize taking care of ourselves more than the average person. Like, the comparison I make is like, I've been in countries and driven in Land Rovers where there aren't roads, right? And those Land Rovers work hard. Mm-hmm. I've also driven in Land Rovers in Wellesley, Massachusetts, going to Whole Foods.
Yeah.
Like those Land Rovers weren't working that hard, right? And if you work in a job where trauma's a routine part of the job, you're a Land Rover working hard. You have to take the maintenance and repair of yourself has to be better than if you just work in, I don't know, selling fruit somewhere.
Right. Yes.
Not right. So I want managers and leaders to understand that it's normal to talk about it and to create space for it. It's normal to help your people think about repair of it. And emotions aren't fatal. You know, people can have emotions in the workplace. And in fact, we feel before we think. If we understand our emotional selves, we're actually better at what we do.
What has been the reaction from the employees that you speak to in these workplace settings? Are they open? Are they willing to talk about their sort of traumas?
I think in the work that I'm doing that's deeper, like the Leading Through Trauma programs, people are very willing to talk. And like you said, like I feel validated, you know, and I feel like I'm being understood. In a lot of, like, you know, the work I've done in the last 2 days here, I think it really was an awareness. You know, an hour of discussion is awareness, and I actually wouldn't want people to just be sharing their whole trauma at that point. That's not the right forum. Mm-hmm. But people really, I think it's very reassuring and relieving that people are naming it at this point, mm-hmm. rather than saying it doesn't exist.
Mm-hmm. And I think to know that your coworkers struggle with the same things that you go through. I mean, today, for example, I was there when a family found out that their loved one had passed away, and mm-hmm. seeing that reaction, and everyone that's worked in news has witnessed something like that. And it really, truly is traumatic. I mean, there's really no, I mean, you never forget those moments. And if you don't mm-hmm. talk about it, and, you know, you talk about it with your photographer, you talk about your coworkers, like, yeah, it's, you know, that's one of the absolute worst things that you could ever witness in our line of work.
Right. Right. And it does matter that you have other people who've gone through it with you.
Mm-hmm. If someone's listening to this and they're thinking, hey, I work somewhere where we could use you, what's going to be the best way for them to get a hold of you? Can companies just hire you for sessions?
Yes. So we have a website, the centerfortraumaandleadership.com. Okay. They can put in a contact, and my colleague and I would be happy to work with them.
Any other advice you have for employees, for managers who are in just an array of positions at this point?
You know, I also want to put in a plug for just working on emotional intelligence. I think that, you know, if you look at my model of preparation, I think not enough companies, like during COVID, what didn't happen is people didn't do professional development with their people. They didn't help people kind of strengthen their capacities. There are young people coming into the workforce who didn't do in-person classes. So people have kind of lost the social communication capabilities and connection. And I think some even what seem like basic things like Strengths Finder or emotional intelligence or communication workshops, those things actually would go a long way to helping the workforce, mm-hmm. even around trauma.
So your second book is what you're working on right now, but your first book, Journey Through Trauma, who would you recommend this to? You know what I mean? Like, who would be the right reader for this book right now?
So anybody who's experienced repeated trauma. And I really recommend it for people like the spouse of somebody who's been through trauma to better understand what that person's going through.
Okay, great. Gretchen, thank you so much. We really appreciate it. We'll have you back on when your second book is out.
Thank you, Whitney. That'll be great.